At Stanford's graduation, a raw, heartfelt song disrupts the ceremony, sung by Thomas Keller, a mechanic who raised his son Andrew alone after his wife's death. Andrew, now a valedictorian, has drifted away, ignoring his father's calls and emails. Thomas, uninvited, leaves a USB with his song for Andrew, a poignant message of love and sacrifice. As the song plays, Andrew confronts years of avoidance, realizing the depth of his father's devotion. The audience is moved, but Thomas slips away unseen. Will Andrew seek him out to mend their bond, or let silence prevail? Honor the unsung heroes in your life by sharing their tales. Join our community to hear more stories of love, sacrifice, and second chances. Comment below with names of those you'd thank. Let's keep their voices alive. When the microphone flickered to life, a song no one anticipated filled the graduation hall, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. It wasn't the usual celebratory anthem, but a voice heavy with emotion, each note trembling with unspoken love, culminating in the words, "Congratulations, son, if you still remember your father." The singer wasn't there, not on the stage or among the sea of faces. He had left only a USB drive, quietly handed to the principal before slipping away unseen before the ceremony began. What followed would linger in the hearts of those who heard it, a testament to the weight of words left unspoken. Thomas J. Keller, 62, carried the marks of a life shaped by hard work and quiet hope. For 35 years, he labored as a mechanic in a small truck repair shop on the edge of Boise, Idaho, his hands perpetually stained with grease, coaxing broken engines back to life with a patience that mirrored his heart. When cancer claimed his wife, Sarah, Thomas was left to raise their 7-year-old son, Andrew, alone. No college degree, no wealth, no network of influence, just a modest paycheck and a conviction that love could bridge any divide. For 17 years, he poured his soul into being a father. He sat through parent-teacher conferences in chairs too small for his frame, listening with pride as teachers spoke of Andrew's promise. He taught himself to braid Andrew's hair for school picture day, his rough fingers fumbling but persistent, each clumsy knot a silent vow. Every report card, every crayon sketch, every certificate found a place in a shoebox that grew into 3, a collection of memories Thomas cherished like treasures. When Andrew's talent for mathematics emerged, Thomas took on double shifts, the exhaustion in his bones outweighed by the dream of giving his son more. When Andrew joined the debate team, Thomas hunted through thrift stores for a suit that would make his boy feel proud, then spent late nights practicing arguments on subjects he barely grasped, his love outweighing his confusion. His heart thrummed with pride, but also with a quiet fear that he might not be enough for the world Andrew was beginning to chase. College changed everything. Andrew's full scholarship to Stanford thrust him into a world of privilege, surrounded by peers whose parents spoke with ease and never carried the scent of motor oil. The phone calls home grew shorter, then sporadic, then ceased. "I'm busy, Dad, I'll call later," Andrew would say, but later never arrived. Thomas kept sending checks, setting up automatic transfers for tuition gaps, learning email on a used computer to send messages that rarely earned replies. Yet he never stopped collecting pieces of Andrew's success, newspaper clippings, screenshots of Dean's List mentions, photos from the university website showing Andrew accepting awards, his smile bright but distant. Each achievement filled Thomas with joy, but also with a growing ache. For Andrew's speeches never mentioned the father whose sacrifices had built that stage. As graduation neared, Thomas waited for an invitation, a call, any sign that his son still saw him. None came. Online, he read that Andrew was valedictorian, destined for a high-flying job in San Francisco, earning more in a year than Thomas could in 3. The article made no mention of family, no nod to the man who had given everything. Still, Thomas bought a train ticket to California, packing his Sunday best navy blue shirt and an old camera to capture his son's moment from the shadows of the auditorium. He also brought a USB drive, holding a song he'd recorded in his small apartment, his voice raw with the weight of a father's love. The night before he left, Thomas sat at his kitchen table under a dim bulb, writing a letter he'd never send. In it, he forgave Andrew for moving beyond the life they'd shared, for finding a world where Thomas's grease-stained hands didn't belong. He apologized for not being the father who could blend into Andrew's new reality, for the simplicity of his love. But he wrote of a love that endured, one that didn't need acknowledgement to exist, one that had carried them through grief and triumph and would carry Thomas to that graduation hall, even if his son's eyes no longer found him. Thomas gripped his worn leather bag as he boarded the first westbound train at dawn, the weight of his final gift to his son nestled inside. It was a gift Andrew didn't yet know he needed, a quiet offering woven from years of unspoken love, regret, and fragile hope. The train's rhythmic clatter through the morning mist mirrored the steady churn of Thomas's thoughts, memories of his son's childhood, the widening gap between them, and the looming moment he both craved and feared. At Stanford University, the auditorium thrummed with vibrant anticipation. Families filled every seat, their faces alight with pride as they awaited their graduate's moment on stage. Cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing smiles and tears for future generations to cherish. Bouquets of roses and lilies perfumed the air, while glittering signs and coordinated T-shirts, some emblazoned with graduation photos, proclaimed familial devotion. The scene was a vivid tapestry of celebration, yet Thomas felt like a ghost within it, his heart heavy with the quiet ache of estrangement. Arriving 3 hours early, Thomas sought no reserved seat but a shadowed vantage point where he could watch Andrew unnoticed. He chose a chair in the back row, half hidden behind a broad pillar that fragmented his view, but cloaked him from the crowd's gaze. His navy blue church shirt, frayed at the cuffs, clung to his frame, and the tie, a gift from his late wife Sarah on their 15th anniversary, hung loosely, a bittersweet reminder of better days. In his weathered hands, he clutched a program printed from the university's website, Andrew's name highlighted in yellow, a beacon of pride and pain. As families poured in, their elaborate preparations, massive bouquets, professional cameras, and glittering signs, unfolded like a festival. Thomas felt small, almost invisible, his solitude a stark contrast to their exuberance. An elderly woman nearby, her silver hair neatly pinned, noticed Thomas alone. Her eyes softened with empathy. "Is this your first grandchild graduating?" she asked, her voice warm. Thomas managed a faint smile, his throat tight. "My son," he murmured, "but he probably won't know I'm here." Confusion flickered across her face, but before she could probe further, the ceremony's opening music swelled, silencing the crowd. 2 hours earlier, Thomas had navigated the university's administration building, his heart pounding with nervous determination. He'd asked to speak with someone about the graduation program, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. After being shuffled through office, he sat across from Dr. Patricia Martinez, the Dean of Student Affairs. Her office, lined with books and framed degrees, exuded calm authority, but her warm gaze eased Thomas's nerves. "Mr. Keller," she said, glancing at his form, "how can I help you today?" Thomas reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing the small USB drive before placing it on her desk like a sacred relic. "My son, Andrew Keller, is graduating today," he began, his voice low. "He's the valedictorian." The words caught in his throat, heavy with unspoken history. "We haven't spoken in over a year. He's built a new life, and I respect that, but I made something for him. A song." His fingers grazed the USB drive, his eyes distant. "I recorded it on my old cassette player, and a guy at the computer shop put it on this. I was hoping, maybe after his speech, you could play it." Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her eyes searching his face. She saw the lines etched by time, the quiet desperation of a father clinging to a fading bond. "What kind of song, Mr. Keller?" she asked softly. Thomas's voice wavered. "Just a father singing to his son. Nothing fancy." He gestured to the USB drive, his hands trembling. "I know it's unusual." Dr. Martinez's expression softened further. "Have you tried reaching out to Andrew directly?" Thomas nodded, his gaze dropping. "For 2 years, but he's busy building his future, and I don't want to be the weight holding him back." As a mother of 3 grown children, Martinez knew the delicate balance of parenting, supporting without smothering, loving without clinging. She recognized the silent grief of a parent left behind, the ache of watching a child carve their own path. Her fingers tapped thoughtfully on the desk. "I'll need to listen to it first," she said. her tone professional, yet compassionate. "But if it's appropriate, I think we can find a way." Thomas exhaled, a knot in his chest loosening, and he left the office feeling lighter, as if sharing his gift had already begun to mend the rift. Before the ceremony, Thomas wandered Stanford's sprawling campus, each step a journey through Andrew's world. He passed the library where his son had burned the midnight oil, the engineering building where he'd wrestled with complex problems, and the dormitory where he'd taken his first steps into independence. Each sight stirred a bittersweet tide in Thomas's heart. Pride for the man Andrew had become. Sorrow for the years they'd lost. He pictured Andrew's laughter in the quad, his hurried steps between classes, his quiet moments of doubt and triumph. His chest ached with all he longed to say, all he hoped the song would express. Now, in the auditorium's shadows, Thomas sat behind the pillar, his view of the stage fragmented but sufficient. The program in his hands, with Andrew's name glowing in yellow, felt like a lifeline. As the ceremony unfolded, his heart tethered to the stage where his son would soon stand, Thomas clung to the hope that his gift, a father's song, might bridge the distance time had carved between them. The auditorium fell hushed, 800 people leaning forward in their seats, curiosity rippling through the air. What kind of message could cap such a momentous day? Then a soft hum broke the silence, followed by the unrefined strumming of a guitar. The sound was raw, unpolished, clearly captured on a modest recorder in a quiet living room. The melody was simple, played by fingers that trembled with emotion rather than uncertainty. A deep, weathered voice followed, each word heavy with decades of unspoken love and regret. "When you took your first steps, my hands shook more than yours did." The voice quivered, not from lack of skill, but from a heart struggling to contain its longing. "When you left for school, I learned how to hold my breath." In the back row, Thomas sat with his eyes closed, his lips silently tracing the lyrics he'd written 3 weeks ago in his small, dimly lit apartment. He'd rehearsed the song countless times, each note an attempt to distill 17 years of devotion, mistakes, and yearning into a fleeting 3-minute melody. Every chord had been a confession, every lyric a plea for a connection he feared was lost forever. He'd poured his soul into the recording, knowing it might be his only chance to reach the son he'd let slip away. On the stage, Andrew stood motionless, his confident demeanor shattered. His face drained of color as recognition dawned, sharp and unyielding. That voice, it was unmistakable. It was the voice that had soothed him to sleep as a child, its low timbre wrapping around him like a blanket. The voice that had roared with pride at his Little League games, cheering louder than any other parent. The voice he'd shut out for 2 years, unable to reconcile the love he'd once known with the pain of their estrangement. Now it filled the auditorium, raw and unguarded, pulling him back to memories he'd buried deep. And today you're standing there, if you still remember. The audience began to sense the weight of the moment, realizing they were witnessing something deeply intimate. A young mother in the third row dabbed at her eyes, her own memories of family stirring within her. An elderly grandfather in the crowd reached for his wife's hand, their fingers intertwining as they shared a silent understanding. Even the faculty on stage, usually composed, seemed touched by the vulnerability in the voice pouring through the speakers. The guitar's gentle melody continued, a tender backdrop to lyrics that spoke of bedtime stories read by flashlight, scraped knees kissed better, and the bittersweet joy of teaching a child to ride a bike, knowing each wobbly pedal meant a step toward independence. Thomas's heart raced as the song played, his mind replaying the years he'd missed. He thought of the nights he'd lain awake, wondering where he'd gone wrong, and the days he'd spent hoping Andrew might call. The song was his bridge across that divide, fragile but earnest, carrying the love he'd never stopped feeling. For Andrew, each word was a jolt, stirring emotions he'd locked away. Pride, anger, grief, and love collided within him, leaving him exposed under the auditorium's bright lights. The voice sang on, a father's heart laid bare, and for a moment the distance between them felt both infinite and impossibly small. As Andrew Keller stood on the stage, the weight of his graduation gown felt heavier than it should, not from the fabric, but from the moment that had just unfolded. The auditorium, filled with 800 souls, had fallen into a hush so profound it seemed the world itself held its breath. Moments earlier, a voice, raw, weathered, yet brimming with a love that refused to be silenced, had poured through the speakers, weaving a song that unraveled years of distance between a father and his son. Each verse was a thread of memory, each chord a testament to a bond that time and stubbornness had tried but failed to sever. Thomas Keller, Andrew's father, sat tucked away in the back row, his worn hands clasped tightly in his lap. His heart raced, a mix of hope and fear swirling within him. He had spent weeks crafting this song, pouring every ounce of his soul into the lyrics, knowing this might be his last chance to reach the son who had grown so far from him. Thomas had always been a man of few words, his love expressed through actions, double shifts at the factory to pay for Andrew's books, late nights learning to type on a secondhand computer just to send emails his son would never open. But this song was different. It was his heart laid bare, a confession of love and regret sung for a room full of strangers, all for the slim hope that Andrew might finally hear him. As he watched his son on stage, Thomas's chest tightened with a fragile hope. He didn't expect forgiveness, not after so many years of silence, but he longed for recognition, a flicker of understanding that his love had never wavered, even when it went unanswered. On stage, Andrew's world had shifted. The song had caught him off guard, each lyric landing like a blow he hadn't seen coming. He had spent years building walls around his heart, convincing himself he didn't need his father, that the man who had raised him was a relic of a past he'd outgrown. Andrew had always been proud of his independence, his ability to carve his own path through sheer will. He'd told himself his father's absence was mutual, that Thomas had faded from his life by choice. But now, as the voice sang of sacrifices, missed dinners, worn-out boots, and dreams set aside for a son's future, those walls began to crumble. Andrew's hands trembled, his polished exterior cracking under the weight of emotions he'd buried for years. He remembered the emails, dozens of them, sitting unread in his inbox. He'd deleted them without a second thought, each one a small act of defiance against the man he thought he'd left behind. Now, those deleted messages felt like a theft, a robbery of moments he could never reclaim. Beside him, Jessica, Andrew's girlfriend of 2 years, stood frozen, her confusion deepening into a quiet ache. She had always seen Andrew as self-made, a man who carried himself with a confidence that suggested he'd never needed anyone. He rarely spoke of his family, and when he did, it was in vague terms that led her to assume his parents were gone, lost to time or tragedy. The idea of a father, and pouring his heart into a song for his son, was a revelation that left her reeling. As the lyrics filled the room, Jessica's eyes darted between Andrew and the crowd, searching for the man whose voice carried such raw devotion. She felt a pang of guilt for never asking more, for assuming Andrew's silence meant there was nothing to tell. Now, watching his face contort with emotions she'd never seen him express, she realized how much he'd been carrying alone. Her hand reached for his, a tentative gesture, but Andrew was too lost in the song to notice. Elena Martinez, the dean who had introduced the ceremony, stood near the microphone, her composed demeanor faltering. In 30 years of guiding students, she had witnessed every shade of family dynamic, estrangements, reunions, quiet resentments, and fierce loyalties. But nothing had prepared her for this. The song was a window into a father's soul, each verse a brushstroke painting a life of sacrifice and unspoken love. Elena thought of her own children, grown and scattered across the country, and the countless times she'd wondered if her efforts had been enough. Tears pricked her eyes as she watched Andrew, his stoic facade giving way to something raw and vulnerable. She marveled at Thomas's courage to bare his heart so publicly, knowing his son might reject him yet again. It was an act of love so profound it left her breathless. In the audience, the song rippled through the crowd, stirring memories and regrets. Parents thought of their own children, of late nights spent worrying, of sacrifices made without fanfare. A mother in the third row clutched her purse, her mind drifting to her daughter, who had moved across the country and rarely called. A father in the balcony reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over his son's number, suddenly desperate to bridge the gap that years of stubborn pride had widened. Students who had come to celebrate their own triumphs found themselves reflecting on the people who had lifted them to this moment. A young woman in the front row thought of her mother, who had worked 2 jobs to pay for her tuition, and vowed to call her that night. The song was a mirror, reflecting the universal ache of love, given freely, often without acknowledgement. As the song reached its final verse, Thomas's voice softened, carrying a tenderness that pierced the silence. He sang of pride in the man Andrew had become, a man who had soared beyond the humble world Thomas had known. "Congratulations, son," he sang, and Andrew's breath caught in his throat. The words were a balm to wounds he hadn't realized he carried. He scanned the crowd, his eyes darting from face to face, a sudden, desperate need to find his father overwhelming him. For years, he'd told himself he didn't care, that his father's absence was proof of indifference. But now, hearing Thomas's voice tremble with love, Andrew realized how wrong he'd been. The man who had raised him, who had worked himself to exhaustion for his son's dreams, was out there, somewhere in this sea of faces. The final lines of the song were spoken, not sung, a quiet confession that carried across the auditorium. "Congratulations, Andrew Keller, from the man who used to be your father." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through Andrew's heart. Used to be. The phrase stung, a reminder of the years they'd lost, of the role Andrew's silence had played in their estrangement. Tears streamed down his face, unheeded, as he stood exposed on the stage. No longer the confident graduate, but a son grappling with a love he'd ignored for too long. When the last chord faded, the auditorium remained silent for a heartbeat, as if no one dared to break the spell. Then a wave of emotion swept through the room, not applause, but something deeper, a collective release of grief, gratitude, and connection. Students turned to their parents, embracing them with a fierceness born of newfound appreciation. Faculty members exchanged glances, their eyes glistening with shared understanding. Strangers reached out, offering tissues or a gentle touch, united by the raw humanity of the moment. Andrew stood rooted to the stage, his chest heaving with sobs he couldn't contain. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't on his future, his career, his plans, his ambitions. They were on his father, the man who had loved him enough to sing this song, knowing it might be his final offering. The man who had let him go, not out of indifference, but out of a love so deep it allowed Andrew the freedom to forge his own path, even if it meant leaving Thomas behind. As the ceremony drew to a close, Andrew's resolve hardened. He needed to find his father. The crowd began to disperse, a sea of faces moving toward the exits, but Andrew pushed through, his eyes scanning every row, every corner. His heart pounded with urgency, a fear that Thomas might slip away before he could reach him. Jessica followed, her hand finally finding his, offering silent support as he searched. Somewhere in that auditorium was the man who had given him everything. And Andrew knew, with a clarity that cut through years of resentment, that finding him was the most important thing he would ever do. In the shadowed back of the auditorium, the seat tucked behind the pillar sat empty, a silent witness to a moment that had already passed. Thomas had fulfilled his purpose, weaving a gift of understanding for his son Andrew, through 3 minutes of melody that carried the weight of a lifetime's devotion. The music had been his final offering, a fragile bridge to reconnect what time and distance had frayed. Now the choice rested with Andrew, to decide what to do with this tender, intangible inheritance. 3 days after his college graduation, Andrew stood on a cracked sidewalk outside a modest apartment building in East Boise, Idaho. The air was warm, tinged with the scent of blooming lilacs, but his chest felt heavy, burdened by the emotions that had churned within him during the 8-hour drive from California. Finding this address had been a grueling task, a puzzle pieced together through old letters, half-remembered conversations, and sheer stubbornness. 2 years ago, Thomas had left their old family home, the one filled with memories of backyard barbecues and late-night talks over math homework. Around the same time, Andrew, caught up in the whirlwind of college and ambition, had stopped answering his father's calls, each missed connection widening the chasm between them. The landlord, Mrs. Chen, stood in the doorway, her weathered face softened by a mix of curiosity and quiet sorrow. Her eyes, sharp despite her age, seemed to see right through Andrew, as if she could sense the weight of his unspoken regrets. "You're Thomas's boy," she said, her voice carrying a faint accent that curled around the words like a warm shawl. It wasn't a question, but a statement heavy with recognition. "He showed me your picture in the newspaper. So proud of you graduating from that fancy college." Her gaze lingered, searching his face for something. Perhaps the echo of the boy Thomas had described. Andrew's throat tightened, his voice raw from the tears he'd shed alone in his car, the road blurring through his grief. "Is he here?" he asked, barely above a whisper, afraid of the answer. Mrs. Chen shook her head slowly, her expression softening further. "He moved out 3 days ago, said he was going on a long trip, didn't say where." She paused, studying Andrew's face as if measuring the depth of his resolve. "But he left something for you, told me if you ever came looking, I should give it to you." She turned and disappeared into her apartment, her footsteps soft but purposeful. Moments later, she returned with a cardboard box, the kind used for moving, worn at the edges but sturdy. Andrew's name was scrawled across the top in his father's meticulous handwriting, each letter a testament to care. "He paid rent for another month," Mrs. Chen added, her voice barely audible, as if sharing a secret. "Said you might need a place to think." Andrew's hands trembled as he carried the box up the narrow stairs to the apartment. The key Mrs. Chen had given him turned smoothly in the lock, opening the door to a space that was starkly empty, save for a single folding chair positioned by a window overlooking the quiet street below and a note taped to the bare wall. The note, written in his father's familiar script, felt like a voice reaching across the years. "Andrew, if you're reading this, then the song found you. I hope it helped you remember what you already knew, that love doesn't need to be perfect to be real. The box holds some things I thought you might want. The apartment is yours for the month if you need time to figure things out. Love, Dad." The words pierced Andrew's heart, stirring a storm of guilt, gratitude, and longing. He sank into the folding chair, the box resting heavily on his lap, and let the weight of his father's love settle over him. Opening the box felt like unearthing a time capsule, each item a fragment of a life Andrew had thought was lost to him. Inside were his childhood art projects, vibrant crayon drawings and clumsy clay sculptures, each one carefully preserved in plastic sleeves as if they were priceless artifacts. There were photographs from his Little League games, faded but vivid in memory, with Thomas always in the background, clapping with unrestrained pride, his smile wide even when Andrew struck out. Report cards, creased from years of handling, bore Thomas's handwritten notes in the margins. "So proud of you, keep shining." A program from Andrew's high school graduation was tucked among the treasures, every mention of his name glowing in yellow highlighter, as if Thomas had wanted to capture every moment of his son's triumph. At the bottom of the box lay a leather journal, its cover worn but unfamiliar. Andrew's breath caught as he opened it to the first page. Dated September 15th, the day he'd left for Stanford. "Drove Andrew to the airport today. He's so excited about college, and I'm proud and terrified at the same time. The house feels too quiet without his music playing upstairs." The words painted a picture of a father grappling with the emptiness of a home that had once been filled with laughter and chaos. Page after page, Thomas's entries chronicled the past 4 years, each one a window into his quiet, steadfast love. He wrote of taking extra shifts at the factory to cover expenses Andrew hadn't even known about. Textbooks, dorm fees, a surprise plane ticket home for Thanksgiving that Andrew had assumed was covered by a scholarship. He described teaching himself to navigate Facebook, fumbling through the platform just to catch glimpses of Andrew's college life. Photos of dorm parties, study groups, and the occasional sunset Andrew posted without a caption. Thomas even wrote about enrolling in a parenting class, determined to understand how to support a son who was soaring into a world far beyond his own. But above all, the journal was a testament to Thomas's pride. Pride in Andrew's academic awards, in the way he carried himself with quiet confidence, in the man he was becoming. "I see so much strength in him," Thomas wrote in one entry, "the kind of strength I never had at his age. He's building a life I could only dream of." The final entry, dated a week before graduation, was raw with vulnerability. "Tomorrow I leave Boise for California. I don't know if Andrew will listen to the song, but I had to try. Some gifts are more for the giver than the receiver. I needed him to know that letting go doesn't mean loving less." Andrew closed the journal, his vision blurred by tears. The weight of the years he'd spent pushing his father away crashed over him. Missed calls, curt texts, the silence he'd built as a wall. But beneath the grief was a spark of determination, a fire kindled by the realization that his father's love had never wavered, even when Andrew had turned away. Finding Thomas would be no easy task. His father had always lived simply, shunning credit cards and social media, moving through the world like a shadow that left few traces. But Andrew was an engineer now, trained to unravel complex systems, to solve problems others deemed impossible. And he had something more. Something his father had instilled in him from the start. Persistence. The apartment, the box, the journal. They were all pieces of a map, a trail Thomas had left behind. As Andrew sat by the window, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the empty room, he felt a resolve take root. He would find his father, not just to mend what was broken, but to rebuild what could still be. The melody from the auditorium lingered in his mind, a reminder that love, however imperfect, was real and worth chasing. Andrew had spent months scouring faded memories and forgotten clues, driven by a quiet ache in his chest that refused to let go. The search wasn't just about finding a man. It was about unearthing the truth of what mattered most in his life. He'd come to understand through sleepless nights and long drives down empty roads that second chances were rare gifts. Not everyone got the opportunity to mend what was broken, to speak the words that lingered unsaid for too long. And not everyone was fortunate enough to hear a song, a simple, heartfelt melody that carried the weight of love and loss, a beacon calling him back before the chance slipped away forever. For Thomas, the world had never been about accolades or recognition. His heart didn't beat for trophies or applause. All he wanted, all he'd ever wanted, was for his son to hear his voice one more time. That voice, weathered by years but warm with memory, had guided Andrew through the cold winters of his childhood, holding his small hand as they trudged through snow or laughed over steaming mugs of cocoa. It was the voice of a father who had poured every ounce of himself into raising a boy who would one day grow into a man. And in a crowded auditorium under the glare of bright lights, that same voice, captured on grainy, outdated equipment, had stopped time. The song Thomas had recorded for Andrew's graduation, a quiet offering from a father who felt he'd faded from his son's life, brought the room to a hush. Hundreds of people sat in silence. But for Andrew, it was as if the world had narrowed to just him and his father's voice, pulling him back from the edge of permanent loss. It wasn't a grand gesture, no sweeping cinematic moment, but it was everything. A final gift from a man who feared he'd been forgotten. 6 months after that transformative night at the graduation ceremony, Andrew found himself standing in a small auto repair shop in Oregon. The air smelled of oil and metal, and the hum of machinery filled the space. Across the garage bay, his eyes locked with Thomas's. For a long moment, neither spoke. The weight of years hung between them, missed calls, unanswered emails, the stubborn pride that had kept them apart, and the fear of rejection that had silenced them both. Thomas, his hands stained with grease, wiped them slowly on a shop rag, his movements deliberate, as if he were steadying himself for what came next. He crossed the garage, his steps cautious but steady, and stopped in front of his son. "You found me," he said, his voice soft but carrying the depth of a man who had waited years for this moment. Andrew's throat tightened, but he managed a small smile. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn journal, its pages creased and dog-eared from months of being carried close to his heart. "You left me a map," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just had to learn how to read it." The journal, filled with Thomas's handwritten notes and reflections, had been the key. A guide through the maze of their fractured relationship, leading Andrew to this moment. They sat together that day, in a quiet corner of the shop, talking for hours. The conversation wasn't easy. It was raw, tangled with the pain of years apart. They spoke of the calls that went unanswered, the emails left unread, the moments when pride had built walls too high to climb. Andrew learned of the fear that had gripped his father, the fear of being a burden, of not being enough, of reaching out only to be met with silence. Thomas, in turn, heard the hurt in his son's voice, the longing for a connection that had slipped through their fingers. But they also spoke of love, the kind that doesn't always shout but whispers in the small, steadfast ways people show they care. Thomas shared how he'd moved to Oregon not just for a fresh start, but to be part of a program for single parents. He'd been volunteering, pouring his heart into helping other fathers navigate the messy complicated relationships with their grown children. I realized, Thomas said, his eyes distant but steady, that maybe my mistakes could help someone else avoid the silence we went through. Andrew listened, his heart heavy with a mix of regret and hope. He saw his father not as the distant figure he'd imagined, but as a man who had been fighting, in his own quiet way, to make things right. The weight of that realization settled over him, not as a burden, but as a bridge, one they could both cross to meet in the middle. 6 months later, Andrew made a choice that surprised even himself. He turned down a high-paying job in San Francisco, a glittering opportunity that promised prestige and success. Instead, he moved to Oregon, taking a position with a small engineering firm. The pay was modest, the work less glamorous, but it kept him close to the man who had raised him, the man whose voice had called him home. Every Sunday, they worked side by side in Thomas's garage, fixing cars under the hum of fluorescent lights. Grease-stained hands and shared laughter became their new language, rebuilding not just engines but something far more precious, the bond between a father and son. They had learned through years of silence and a single song that love is patient enough to wait for understanding, strong enough to endure the weight of time. On Father's Day that year, Andrew gave Thomas a gift that carried the weight of their shared journey. It was a professionally recorded version of the graduation song, the one that had changed everything. This time, Andrew's voice joined his father's, weaving harmony into the original melody. As the notes filled the air, it was a testament to what they'd rebuilt, proof that some relationships can be mended, some goodbyes can be undone. In those 3 minutes of music, they found the conversation they'd been searching for, a dialogue made of melody and memory carried across a lifetime of second chances.